Sir Walter Elliot of Kellynch Hall in Somersetshire was a man who, for his own amusement, never took up any book but the Baronetage. There he found occupation for an idle hour. I'm Harriet.
And I'm Ellen, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
Welcome to Season 5, in which we're reading our favourite Jane Austen book, Persuasion. We're going to be starting with chapters 1 to 3, but before that, maybe we should do a quick publishing history.
She finished writing Emma on the 29th of March 1815, and a few months later, on August the 8th, she started to write Persuasion. And if you think about it, between these two dates, something quite significant had happened, which was the Battle of Waterloo.
Yes, on the 18th of June, so less than a month earlier, the Battle of Waterloo finally ended the war with France.
Yes.
And, I mean, who knows how long she'd been thinking about Persuasion, but that is quite significant in terms of the plot, which I think we'll probably talk about when we're talking about the first chapters.
Yes.
So she starts writing it on the 8th of August, and then on the 8th of July 1816, so just under a year later, she basically finished the first draft of Persuasion.
Yes.
But she wasn't completely happy with it, and we know this because we actually have a copy of the chapter she cancelled and then the replacement chapters she wrote, which were completed on the 6th of August 1816. That was also, I think, about the time she started to get really sick. But then on the 13th of March 1817, so that's a few months later, she actually wrote to her niece Fanny Knight saying that I have a something ready for publication, which may perhaps appear about a 12-month hence. It is short, about the length of Catherine. So that something was Persuasion. And I think we'll probably talk about this when we're talking about the end of Persuasion. But a lot of people do feel that she actually had more she was originally planning to write that then didn't eventuate, which is why it's a much shorter book. But she had already moved on to start working on Sanditon. But people do sometimes wonder if she hadn't been getting ill by that stage, whether she mightn't have spent more time on it. But anyhow, what we do know from there is that on the 24th of May 1817, that's when she was really very ill. She went to Winchester with Cassandra, and then on the 18th of July that year she died. And in December that year, the 4-volume Persuasion and Northanger Abbey were published.
Yes.
So as I said, we're doing chapters 1 to 3 in this episode. Your 100-word summary of those chapters.
All right. Sir Walter Elliot of Kellynch, a widower, prides himself on his good looks and his status as a baronet, and judges others by these criteria. He has 3 daughters, but favours the eldest, Elizabeth. Anne the second is appreciated by her mother's old friend, Lady Russell. Believing that he is simply living according to the demands of his status, Sir Walter runs into debt and expects Lady Russell and his agent, Mrs. Shepherd, to solve his problems. He agrees to move to Bath and rent Kellynch out to Admiral Croft.
Okay, so this is mine. Sir Walter Elliot, Baronet of Kellynch Hall, is a widower with 3 daughters. Mary, the youngest, is married, but Elizabeth and Anne aren't, though Elizabeth had hoped to marry the heir presumptive. Sir Walter is in debt and rejects the suggestions from family friend Lady Russell in consultation with Anne on how to retrench. Encouraged by his lawyer Mr. Shepherd and Shepherd's daughter Mrs. Clay, he decides to move to Bath and let Kellynch. The tenant will be Admiral Croft. Anne seems curiously well informed about the Crofts and clearly has a history, perhaps with Mrs. Croft's brother Mr. Wentworth. One of the really interesting things about this book that we get right from the start is that every other Jane Austen book, people tie themselves up in knots trying to work out exactly when it's set. You can work out an internal timeline, but you don't know what year it's in. With this one, you get it right there in chapter 1. You know exactly when it's happening. At this present time, the summer of 1814. So
Yes.
That's June, July, August, probably June-ish in 1814. And of course, that is not long after the abdication of Napoleon, which was on the 6th of April.
And which was followed, of course, by the signing of the Treaty of Paris on the 30th of May, 1814, where all the rest of Europe made peace with France's new government.
And at that point, Napoleon is exiled to the island of Elba.
That's the peace that Mr. Shepherd mentions.
Yeah, and so that's why these naval officers will be coming back due to the peace, and Sir Walter might find someone to let Kellynch to. Of course, none of them know that early the next year, just after the book finishes, Napoleon's going to escape from Elba and it'll be back on for 100 days until Waterloo.
Yes.
Chapter 1, when we were talking about Sense and Sensibility, I said chapter 1 is this big info dump.
Yes.
Well, it's kind of the same here. You're getting this info dump, but it's so much more interesting.
Well, she knows what she's doing. Once we're up to Mansfield Park and Emma, she knows how to slide into it.
Yeah.
But in this one, she can not only slide into it, she does something she did with Pride and Prejudice. It's funny.
Yes.
It's entertaining.
And I think another thing you get in this first chapter that you certainly didn't in Sense and Sensibility is it's all about the characters and their personalities. You learn so much, particularly about Sir Walter and Elizabeth. In this first chapter, you're really given their characters.
Well, I think the other thing that you look at here is, in fact, the tone she's using and the way she keeps it up. It's this one where you've got all these layers of things you're being told.
Yeah.
You're being told straight information, but you're also being told what the characters in the book are like.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you've got Jane Austen's ironic take.
Yeah.
So it comes through with this particular style of writing that is ironic, but also tells you what the characters are thinking or feeling, and underneath that you've got the straight story.
Yeah. But the characters, you learn what they're thinking and feeling. We have 3 chapters, and it's not until the very end of them that we learn what Anne is thinking and feeling.
Yeah.
We learn all about Sir Walter's inner life, and we learn all about Elizabeth's inner life, and we even learn quite a lot about Lady Russell's inner life, what she thinks, what she's like. Everything about Anne is given externally. We just don't get inside her head in these 3 chapters.
So you're starting to think, is this going to be a Cinderella plot?
Yeah.
That doesn't really tell you where it's going.
Yeah.
So when's the prince going to come?
But if we're thinking of this, and I'm just talking about chapter 1 now, if we're thinking of this as Cinderella, which we're getting the hints, we're also getting Lady Russell as the fairy godmother, which of course will later, not in these first 3 chapters, but later come out that if she's a fairy godmother, she's got feet of clay.
Yes.
It's so interesting that in the first chapter in particular, you kind of get cued into the fact that Anne is going to be the main character. But you learn about everyone around Anne and learn almost nothing about Anne herself in these chapters, except right at the very end.
Yes.
As the book progresses, she zeroes in so much more on Anne.
Yes.
But these first chapters, Anne is opaque to us. You'd think writing a book, it would kill the book to have the first chapters always stepping around the main character, never getting into the main character, but it doesn't.
No.
You're just so caught up in it. It's so funny and it's so clever and it's so revealing. The other thing we don't get with Anne is not only do we not get inside Anne's head, we don't know anything about her story. If you're being attentive, we do start to get some little hints. The first one is so minor it's almost completely overlookable in chapter 1, where it says that a few years before, Anne Elliot had been a very pretty girl, but her bloom had vanished early. But if you're just reading it, I'm not sure you'd necessarily pick up on that as being important.
Something had happened, yes.
Yeah.
And it's also then starting the theme that's going to be coming up later always, how Anne's bloom has vanished and comes back. But also this whole question of physical beauty.
Yeah.
Which on one hand, she gets so cross with Sir Walter for sort of being so proud of himself, but on the other hand, thinks it's absolutely lovely to see Anne's bloom coming up. So it's just this theme of the significance of personal appearance as this other theme that I think's coming up, which is pride in station. We're getting this question of what is the entitlement of rank? What are you entitled to because of rank? And also what are your obligations because of rank? though it ceases to be important when Sir Walter's off the scene.
Well, that's because I think it gets replaced with achievement in the Navy.
Yes.
Yeah, on the one hand, you have pride in rank, and on the other hand, you have rising through personal achievement.
Yeah,
personal appearance.
The career open to the talents as against heredity, yes.
So chapter 2 is where they make the decision to quit Kellynch and decide where to go, and also chapter 2 is where we meet Mr. Shepherd and Mrs. Clay.
Yes.
And I found in chapter 2 and then even more chapter 3, just admiring the way Mr. Shepherd is managing Sir Walter. Chapter 3 is just awesome in that regard, but even in chapter 2 you're kind of seeing that Mr. Shepherd doesn't want to make any recommendations. He basically steps back and says whatever Lady Russell says, because he knows that
he doesn't want it to be held up against him.
Yeah.
And them saying, you made me do this and look, it didn't work.
But then as soon as Sir Walter says the words quit Kellynch Hall, he leaps onto it, because that's obviously what he wanted to do all along. But now he can say it because Sir Walter has said it first.
Yes.
So then we get the comedy of Sir Walter saying he's agreed to let it out, but of course they can't advertise.
Yes.
It has to be a profound secret, not to be breathed beyond their own circle.
Well, I mean, that's no problem to Mr. Shepherd.
Mrs. Clay is introduced in this chapter. We don't really get much about her except the authorial description, which says she was a clever young woman who understood the art of pleasing at least at Kellynch Hall. We're set up exactly to know what to think about Mrs. Clay.
What I would really like to know is why her marriage wasn't prosperous. I find that
I assumed from that her husband had died possibly in debt, which is why she and her children have come back to her father's place.
Well, that's what one can assume.
I guess, or just it wasn't a particularly happy marriage, because unprosperous normally you'd think would mean no children, but there are children.
Unprosperous spreads the possibilities that it could have been the children, he could have got sick, he could have done this or that, but prosperous on its own would almost certainly means money.
Yeah. But yeah, I just assumed unprosperous did mean financially unprosperous.
Yes.
And now he's dead and she's back living with her father with her 2 children.
Yes.
2 children, by the way, who never again appear in the book.
Perhaps Mrs. Shepherd is minding them.
We do in this chapter get a bit more about Lady Russell as well, and I like the description of her being a woman rather of sound than quick abilities.
Well, are they particularly sound? I mean, in terms of the book, just about everything she's interested in, it turns out to be unsound.
Oh, well, it does say, it actually sets her up here by saying her difficulties in coming to any decision in this instance were great from the opposition of 2 leading principles. On the one hand, she has strict integrity herself, but on the other hand, she has this
enormous respect for rank.
We get told about Lady Russell's integrity, but then we get told even more strongly about Anne's integrity, where she wanted everything on the side of honesty against importance. So we get told that she's basically the only decent one in the family.
Yes.
And that she considered it as an act of indispensable duty to clear away the claims of creditors with all the expedition which the most comprehensive retrenchments could secure. But then we learn that they're going to Bath and more Cinderella stuff. The usual fate of Anne attended her in having something very opposite from her inclination fixed on. She disliked Bath and did not think it agreed with her, and Bath was to be her home.
Yes.
But the bit I then find interesting, again, just this little snippet that we probably will miss the first time we read it. When Lady Russell dismisses Anne saying she doesn't like Bath, saying yes, it's just because she was at school there, and secondly, from her happening to be not in perfectly good spirits the only winter which she had afterwards spent there with herself.
And when the second time through you think, is that the way you talk about, you told her to break off her engagement?
Yes, and then you took her to Bath with you.
Yes.
I think you have to assume that that's why she wasn't in perfectly good spirits, because she'd just broken off her engagement.
Yes.
It's a little tiny hint that you'll probably miss, that something happened to Anne in the past.
Yes.
Chapter 3 is all about letting Kellynch to Admiral Croft. And rereading it this time, I'd never really noticed before just how carefully Mr. Shepherd and Mrs. Clay are manipulating Sir Walter. So even before the chapter started, even before Admiral Croft's name came up when he first just suggested the Navy, he had quite possibly already heard or had some hint that Admiral Croft might be in.
He knows Admiral Croft's there. Somebody's told him about him from London. Yeah.
And I think he's probably also briefed Mrs. Clay because they're both going all in about how good the Navy is.
I think actually, when I read it through this time, the very first thing, though, that struck me about Mr. Shepherd and Mrs. Clay was how fawning they are.
Yes.
How incredibly flattering. And how Sir Walter doesn't mind. How Sir Walter, laps it all up.
I'm picturing Mr. Shepherd as probably not behaving like that to all his people he works for, but he knows that that's how to manage Sir Walter, and he really wants Sir Walter to move away, to let Kellynch, to get some money, and he knows that the best way to get Sir Walter to do things is to be so fawning to him.
But we have to realise it matters to Mr. Shepherd. I mean, we don't know how many other clients Mr. Shepherd has.
Yeah.
There's a really big estate. The agent possibly has very little time for outside jobs. So if that estate falls apart, his job's gone.
True. I just thought it was so masterly the way they're managing him. They have this first visit where they just introduce the idea of the Navy, where Mr. Shepherd says the peace will be turning all our rich naval officers ashore.
Well, then you've got that wonderfully comic bit where Sir Walter explains why he doesn't think anyone should go into the Navy.
Yes.
But he's basically really saying, I don't want anything to do with anyone out of the Navy. Yeah. They're upstarts and they're ugly.
Yeah. But then you've got Mrs. Clay comes in, and this is why I think Mr. Shepherd has probably briefed Mrs. Clay before they even made their visit. Because Mrs. Clay comes in with her long bit about this is being severe indeed, have mercy on the poor men. But then is not that the same with many other professions? And she lists through professions, and then it even says she stopped a moment to consider what she might do for the clergyman. Yes. So she's obviously working with her father to get Sir Walter to be open to the idea of a naval officer, so that on their next visit they can then say Admiral Croft.
Oh yes, one knows that's all planned.
Yeah.
He brings her along to help him flatter.
Yeah.
Or to put her onto Elizabeth, so between them they can get this idea into their heads.
Yes.
There's something I wanted to say about that. We've talked about how clever Mr. Shepherd is with the way he talks to Sir Walter.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is you start to see how Mrs. Clay is going about, in effect, beginning flirting with Sir Walter. He said something, and in a sort of very sweet way, she says, oh no, I think you're wrong, which it's a bit flirtatious, sort of a basic flirting by disapproving, but she cleverly turns it right round to say the only good-looking men in the world are going to be the landed gentry. All the other professions, as well as the Navy, have these disabilities. The only people that aren't like that are the landed gentry. The whole chapter is just full of showing how there are these flatterers and how the fact of people thinking they're very special attract them.
But then after that, the narrator says, it seemed as if Mr. Shepherd, in this anxiety to bespeak Sir Walter's goodwill towards naval officer as tenant, had been gifted with foresight. Not actually coming out and saying, of course he already knew.
But that's her way of adding the irony.
But you also do have to read it quite carefully, because it says the first application was from an Admiral Croft with whom he shortly afterwards fell into company. So at that point you could be thinking, oh, maybe it was foresight. But then it goes on to say, and indeed he had received a hint of the Admiral from a London correspondent.
Yes, so he'd obviously been saying to people in London.
Yeah. And again, we get Mr. Shepherd's masterly management of Sir Walter presenting all the arguments in favour of Admiral Croft, like the fact that he's got a wife but there's no children, and that's the best preserver of furniture.
But you get the lovely bit where Mrs. Clay, I think it's almost the first thing she says, is sailors are so neat and tidy.
Yes.
And then they build up on the others.
But then he starts to also build up on Mrs. Croft's connection to the area, but as soon as he realises Sir Walter doesn't like that, he steps away from it. But there's also this lovely little line where he's trying to remember the name of the gentleman who lived at Monkford, Mr. Croft's brother, and thinks he's got Mrs. Clay there to back him up. But at this particular moment, Mrs. Clay was talking so eagerly with Miss Elliot that she did not hear the appeal. So they're not quite working in concert at this moment.
Yes.
And I think that is our first hint that actually Mrs. Clay has her own agenda, which we will learn later is, in fact, she wants to marry Sir Walter.
And of course, right in the middle of this, we get sort of Anne's first real talking. They mention Admiral Croft, and it turns out, oh yes, Anne knows all about Admiral Croft. Nobody says, how did you? Nobody is interested in what.
Yeah, that's what I was going to go on to next, that this is the chapter that builds us up to get a sense of what happened. Without actually telling us, but we just know there's something, because Anne's first line of speech in the book earlier in the chapter is the one where she says that the Navy have done so much for us. Yeah. But then when Admiral Croft is mentioned, Anne just out of nowhere comes out, he is a Rear Admiral of the White. He was in the Trafalgar action and has been in the East Indies since. He was stationed there, I believe, several years. And the reader is probably wondering, how on earth does she know this?
Yes.
I assume, basically, she's still been getting the Navy lists. I doubt she's followed the career of every single naval officer there is, but knowing that Admiral Croft is married to Wentworth's sister has made her interested to follow him as well as Wentworth's career.
Yes.
I think we have to assume that.
Oh, I think we do, yes. Yeah. But again, we can only work it out when we've read it as many times as we have.
Yeah. And then her third line is when Mr. Shepherd is trying to remember the name of someone, and after waiting another moment, "You mean Mr. Wentworth, I suppose," said Anne. And then right at the end of the chapter, it says, Anne, who had been a most attentive listener to the whole, left the room to seek the comfort of cool air for her flushed cheeks, and as she walked along a favourite grove, said with a gentle sigh, "A few months more, and he perhaps may be walking here." Yes. And that's where the chapter ends. And of course, we know that the next chapter picks up saying,
it wasn't Mr. Wentworth of Monkford. Yes.
But it's so setting us up. When there's that pause, and then she says, "You mean Mr. Wentworth," we immediately leap on that and think, aha, that's what happened. I'm clever, I've worked this out. She had an unhappy romance with this Mr. Wentworth, and then in the next chapter you learn you were actually not right at all.
Yes.
Oh, one other thing I had highlighted. Mr. Wentworth, it turns out, though we wouldn't know it in this chapter, never really appears in the book. But when Mr. Shepherd is talking about him, he says, "He came to consult me once, I remember, about a trespass of one of his neighbours, farmer's man breaking into his orchard, wall torn down, apples stolen, caught in the act, and afterwards, contrary to my judgment, submitted to an amicable compromise." So that is basically setting up Mr. Wentworth as a decent person.
Yes.
But yeah, that was everything I had on those 3 chapters.
Yes.
Other than the fact that for 3 chapters that sideline the person who is going to be the main character and who give you so much backstory about everything except the person who is going to be the main character. They are so fun to read.
And even giving us a whole lot of information you don't actually need for the plot. If it's going to be a Cinderella story, what is the purpose of giving us all this story about the Elliots and their problems and their money troubles? What is it there for? It's only, in a sense, really, it's to give a comic background for the Cinderella story, to tell you about the problems Anne is facing at home.
What was your favourite sentence?
Well, the one I've chosen is one you were actually referring to before. The lawyer plods quite careworn. The physician is up at all hours and travelling in all weathers, and even the clergyman. She stopped a moment to consider what might do for the clergyman. And even the clergyman, you know, is obliged to go into infected rooms and expose his health and looks to all the injury of a poisonous atmosphere. It's interesting again, she's focusing on one of the things that Sir Walter cares about. It's what effects with their looks.
Well, my favourite sentence is about Sir Walter.
Yes.
It comes in the very first chapter, and it's talking about Sir Walter remaining single for his dear daughter's sake. And it says, "For one daughter, his eldest, he would really have given up anything, which he had not been very much tempted to do."
Yes.
first character we're going to talk about for Persuasion, and I think it's quite appropriate because the book starts with him, is Sir Walter Elliot.
One thing I thought we could think about is compare the way a baronet behaves in this book compared with how the baronet behaved in Mansfield Park. Sir Walter is incredibly wrapped up in the fact that he's a baronet, that he's got this background, he reads his book. Could you imagine Sir Thomas Bertram? And I think it's fitting up with perhaps the reasons why Jane Austen sort of seems to be highly critical of people with handles to their names in this book, whereas in Mansfield Park, she treats Sir Thomas as though he's simply a standard part of the gentry.
Yeah.
This group that goes from a clergyman with a very good living up to a baronet with a lot of money.
Yeah.
And you judge them more or less as individuals against their behaviour as gentlemen. Whereas Sir Walter is absolutely convinced that being a baronet puts you way, way ahead of all the other gentry. And yet he's gentry. He is not a peer.
When he's first introduced, it says, vanity was the beginning and end of Sir Walter's character. Vanity of person and of situation. And I think those are the two things. On the one hand, you've got he's just so enamored of his own personal appearance. And he thinks that is just one of the two most important things in the world, is looking nice, which is one of the reasons I guess he values Elizabeth more than Anne or Mary.
We're told that Anne hasn't got the sort of good looks that he admires, though obviously Lady Russell must have had the kind of looks he approved of.
Although he also thinks she's letting herself go now.
Well, he thinks she's letting herself run to seed. But on the other hand, as we learn later, if somebody flatters him enough, he can start to disregard how badly they look.
Yeah.
So he can approve of Mrs. Clay in spite of her freckles and her protruding tooth.
Because she grovels to him so much.
Yes.
And that's on the other side of him being so, valuing his rank so highly.
And the other way he values his rank is not the way that probably Sir Thomas Bertram valued his, which allowed him to sort of, get into county business and so on. Whereas with Sir Walter, it's all his entitlement.
Yes.
And he wasn't bothering to do the sort of public service, the sort of boring magistrate's jobs, like turning up and granting people licences to open an inn, or dealing with really petty criminals or two people having a fight. The sort of thing, say, that Mr. Wentworth.
Exactly. I was just thinking that when Mr. Wentworth spoke to Mr. Shepherd about the person who'd broken in, maybe in a different circumstance he would have spoken to Sir Walter.
He doesn't even turn up at the quarter sessions, which is where all the people who were prepared to make an effort to do their part in local government.
Yes, that's true. Mr. Shepherd goes to the quarter sessions at Taunton, and then later on we learn that Mr. Musgrave, he goes to the assizes.
They all happen at, it's called quarter because 4 times a year.
Yeah.
And it's the whole local government, including the legal system of the county.
But obviously Sir Walter considers himself above that kind of thing.
Well, he just does what he feels like doing.
Yeah. So he looks only at his rights and not at his obligations.
Another criticism that Jane Austen makes of the way he wears his honours and what he thinks they entitle him to, and even the way he considers himself as a baronet, which comes later on when Anne joins them in Bath, and she feels almost ashamed. She might not wonder, but she must sigh, that her father should feel no degradation in his change. He should see nothing to regret in the duties and dignity of the resident landholder, should find so much to be vain of in the littleness of a town.
But the other thing, of course, in Bath, and I think this also is where Anne feels ashamed of him, is the way they then grovel to Lady Dalrymple and Miss Carteret.
Of course, they're being consistent. They think that Mr. Shepherd and Mrs. Clay should grovel to them.
Yeah. I suppose the other thing it might be worth talking about with Sir Walter is what he's like as a father. Because I would put him up there as one of the worst fathers in Jane Austen. I'd probably even rank him as bad as, if not worse, than General Tilney.
What about Mr. Price? No, Mr. Price does the right thing by his boys. All his boys are being found jobs. They can roar around the place.
Yeah. Though he does have the same kind of favouritism that Sir Walter does.
Yes.
He values his boys and doesn't much care for his girls, and so he's not particularly nice to Fanny. Actually, having said that, Sir Walter doesn't actually oppose Anne getting engaged to Captain Wentworth. He's so completely indifferent to her that he just doesn't care.
And sort of luckily for him, the two girls that he cares nothing about do all right for themselves. Another thing about him is that when Mr. Elliot drops out of sight, he's not saying he was meant to be marrying Elizabeth. He let her down. He said it was very bad. We were seen at Tattersall's and in the lobby of the House of Commons. He doesn't even notice what Elizabeth's going through.
Yeah.
And again, the places he's been seen are these all-male places like Tattersall's. He's very much thinking, what are the other men with titles and the state's going to think of me?
He's also, of course, not noticed that Elizabeth is a bit frustrated with her life now.
Can we think of what we know about Sir Walter's financial situation?
Yep.
He has inherited the baronet title and also this very large and successful Kellynch estate.
Yep.
But the Kellynch estate, like Mr. Bennet's, practically all of it's entailed.
Yeah.
And as he's sort of asked Mr. Shepherd for more money and more money and more money, Mr. Shepherd has managed to mortgage bits of the estate.
So presumably those would be the bits of the estate that are not entailed, that he could, if he chose, sell. It does say there's a portion that he could have sold, but he won't.
Yes.
He is going to pass it on entire as he received it.
Yes.
Which to me suggests most of it is entailed and under trustees and he can't do anything. A portion of it is not entailed. He could sell it, but he won't.
But also he must have received at some point some money, possibly the marriage settlements from his wife. Somehow there's £30,000 available for his three daughters.
It says Anne was entitled to £10,000, though it also says he couldn't actually give it to her right away. One thing that fascinates me is that Mr. Elliot is the heir presumptive, and that is important because if Mrs. Clay does manage to marry Sir Walter and then has another child and it's a boy, then Mr. Elliot is out on his ear, he gets nothing.
Yes.
In Pride and Prejudice, they always say Mr. Collins is the heir. They never say Mr. Collins is the heir presumptive.
Which he is.
Which he is. And there's even that bit where Mr. Bennet says to Mrs. Bennet, you may die before me. Well, the corollary of that is if Mrs. Bennet's nerves were to take her off, and then Mr. Bennet remarried someone younger, which he could do, and had a son, suddenly the Collinses ain't going to get nothing. The big difference, of course, is that Mrs. Bennet is still alive and Lady Elliot isn't still alive, but it is such a key part of the Mr. Elliot plot in this book.
Well, look, it's partly just what language is prepared to be used. The Bennets know that, but they're not really foreseeing Mrs. Bennet dying.
Yeah.
And calling him the heir is only in conversation.
Yeah.
Whereas the phrase heir presumptive is a formal way, and that's why Sir Walter has written it as sort of a serious legal descriptive term. Right, well, he's not nice, but he's terribly funny. We don't see him much after these chapters, but every time we do, it's very funny.
Yeah. Well, he's in these chapters, and then he disappears completely because he goes to Bath, but then we see him a lot again in Bath. That is, I suppose, also interesting that you get so much of him setting him up in these early chapters, and then he disappears for at least half the book before coming back when Anne goes to Bath.
Actually, something that just struck me then is I do not have any picture of this wonderfully good-looking 54-year-old man. Can you think of you'll be able to tell us about what actors they've chosen for him.
Kind of like the Mr. Woodhouses, the Sir Walters are being somewhat different across different adaptations. I haven't found any of the Sir Walters particularly good looking. None of them are like an older Colin Firth or
Laurence Olivier.
or an older Hugh Grant. Yeah, just thinking of the people who've played Jane Austen heroes getting older, none of them have gone on to play Sir Walter. Sir Walter, I think, has generally been played by character actors. And sometimes by very good character actors. I'm certainly not saying that.
Yes.
But they seem to me to have cast for character acting ability rather than for matinee idol good looks.
Yes. Today I'm going to be talking about what the book starts with, which is the baronetage. In an earlier series of this podcast, I gave a certain amount of information about baronets, but I'll be expanding on it here.
That was the Mansfield Park season, and I think that was episode 1 as well.
The baronetcy grew out of the trouble the Stuart kings had in persuading Parliament, which was the legislature of the country, to approve taxes to pay for the administration of the state. In 1611, James I's officials came up with a new scheme for raising money that was resorted to by him and then by his son Charles I and by his grandson Charles II in times of financial crisis. In 1611, it was announced that the king was prepared to create a new titled order which would rank between the barons and the knights. The baronet was to share the knight's form of address, Sir Walter Elliot, Sir Thomas Bertram, etc.
And of course, that's always Sir Christian name, surname, or even just Sir Christian name, but it's never Sir surname. Although the wife is Lady surname and never gets to be Lady Christian name unless she's already a lady in her own right.
And that's if her father was a Duke, a Marquis or an Earl.
Which is why Lady Catherine de Bourgh is Lady Catherine and not Lady de Bourgh, even though her husband was Sir Louis de Bourgh.
Yes. But unlike knights, like Sir William Lucas and Lady Russell's unnamed husband, and like the barons and the ranks above him, the title was to be hereditary, to pass to the baronet's closest male relation when he died. On the other hand, baronets were not peers but commoners. They were not to have any right to sit in the House of Lords. If, like Sir Thomas Bertram, they wanted to play a part in government, they had to get themselves elected into the House of Commons. The designers of the title seem to me to have been trying very hard to make it attractive to country gentlemen with a bit of money to spare. It was presented to them as a call from the king to support his troops in Ulster. They would donate to the king the sum required to maintain 30 soldiers for 3 years at 8p a day, and that came to £1,095. In fact, they didn't have to pay it as a lump sum. I think they could pay a year at a time, something like that. In return, the king would reward their loyalty and patriotism by making them members of this new order of baronets, which originally was to be restricted to just 200 members. Furthermore, membership was not to be open to old anybody with £1,095 to spare. The commissioners were told that to be eligible, candidates must be men of quality, with a state of living and good reputation worthy of the same, that is, men of quality, and at least descend from a grandfather on the father's side who bore arms and who had a certain yearly revenue of £1,000 or more. So they would seem to be a very select group. And bearing arms, which they had to have a grandfather who did it, meant having the right, acknowledged by the College of Arms, to display a specific crest on their houses, their tombstones, their family silver, and the doors of their coaches. Getting a coat of arms, which had to be approved by certain Crown officials, was usually the first step taken by someone who was aiming to lift their family from middling ranks into the gentry. This is one of the things that's always noted about Shakespeare, that his father, who was a glover, and while he was successful, he was trying to get a coat of arms, sending it into the heralds and so on. And so they weren't prepared to let someone in who was the first to bear arms. There had to be arms there for 2 generations. The promised conditions were not in fact observed. The money wasn't specifically spent on the army, but as the writer in my 1875 encyclopedia says rather tartly, it actually passed at once into the king's exhausted exchequer. Nor were the numbers limited to 200. James I's commissioners went on accepting more and more suitable candidates from England long after the number 200 was passed, while under Charles I the dignity was extended to suitable candidates from Scotland and Ireland. None of the accounts I've found tell you whether the price went up and down, but they all imply that when kings were facing money shortages, baronetcies were marketed quite aggressively, particularly by Charles II. When he returned from exile in 1660, he immediately began to create lots of new baronetcies. And when, in Persuasion, Jane Austen had to choose a time when the Elliots got their baronetcy, she chose them to get it from Charles II. Though it's still very hard for any of us to know why she did this. Did she think it was a feather in their caps, or did she think it was a pretty low way of getting a baronet?
Yeah.
I want to focus now on Sir Walter's favourite book, which, since he had had to insert the date of Mary's marriage in 1810, was probably Debrett's Baronetage of 1808. But this was not an official publication like the Navy List that was issued by the Admiralty, but a commercial publication by a private publisher who believed there was a market for such works. The earliest book that concerns us here was, however, a semi-official, if not an official production. The Dugdale, mentioned in Persuasion. In 1682, Sir William Dugdale published a book called The Ancient Usage in Bearing of Such Ensigns of Honour as are commonly called arms, with a catalogue of the present nobility of England, by William Dugdale, to which is added a catalogue of the present nobility of Scotland and Ireland. And what this meant was aspiring baronets could prove that their grandfathers on their father's side had indeed borne arms. In the 1700s, however, the commercial ventures came thick and fast. I've looked for books with baronetage in their titles in the catalogue of the Jisk Library Hub, and the earliest I found listed there was published in London in 1741 and was called The English Baronetage, containing a genealogical and historical account of all the English baronets now existing, their descents, marriages and issues, illustrated with the coats of arms on copper plates. I can't promise that this is actually the earliest, because I've lost my expertise with this sort of research since the website called Copac disappeared. The publishers that emerged from the pack in this race to get out baronetages were Debrett's and Burke's, and most of the notes to modern editions of Persuasion cite baronetcies published by one of these two famous names that fit the time frame. But there were others. I was looking at the family papers of one of the early feminists who came from a very well-off family, and in amongst them there was a sort of an application form to be in one of these listing books. It was Burke's History of the Landed Gentry. was just like any of the application forms you fill in if you're trying to join a society or apply for a bed in a hospital.
So what period was this?
It was a bit later than this. It was in the 1840s.
Uh-huh.
But there was one little oddity that struck me. We've got for sons names of marriages, etc., saying minute specifications requested, whereas daughters, names and marriages of, in brackets it says ages not required. But it looks so modern, so formal, neatly printed, and somebody has sort of half finished filling this one in.
For the pop culture sections in our Persuasion season, I'm going to take the same approach I did when we were doing Emma and just talk about one adaptation per week. Because
Yes.
I've ended up finding that easier than trying to cover all of them just for certain sections of the book.
And how many pop culture versions have there been?
There have actually been, in total, 6 fairly straight adaptations.
Yes.
There was one in 1960, there was one in 1971, there was a Spanish language one in 1972, there was one in 1995, one in 2007, and then most recently one in 2022. One thing that really sets film and TV adaptations of Persuasion apart from the other Jane Austen adaptations is you have 2 locations that still exist. You have Lyme Regis, and specifically you have the Cobb on Lyme Regis.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Bath still has so much beautiful Georgian streets, and the locations mentioned in the book, not all, but some of them still exist. And because of this, most adaptations use these locations, whereas other adaptations, they're mostly set in country houses, country villages, and you have that here as well, of course, but they don't have these set pieces in real places that adaptations can really use. Although the interesting thing with the Cobb on Lyme Regis is there are actually 3 different sets of stairs on the Cobb, and different adaptations use different sets of stairs.
Yes.
First of all, I'm just going to briefly mention the one from 1960, which was 4 episodes of 30 minutes each, but this is no longer available. It was probably destroyed in the great BBC clean-out of the 1970s when we also lost lots of early Doctor Who.
Oh, right, yes.
And apparently the script also isn't available, or at least someone who wrote a book on adaptation said she also couldn't find the script of this one. But
Yeah.
I do have the cast list. And just a couple of points to make about that. Anne Elliot was played by Daphne Slater. So this was 1960. In 1948, Daphne Slater had played Harriet Smith in a BBC Emma, which we no longer have. And then in 1952, in a BBC Pride and Prejudice, she played Elizabeth Bennet opposite Peter Cushing. Again,
Yeah.
a version we no longer have access to. So this means not only has she played in 3 Jane Austen adaptations, which is more than most people, she has also been the heroine in 2 of them, which is pretty impressive. Captain Wentworth was played by Paul Daneman, who in that same year in the BBC Emma played George Knightley.
Oh, well.
So they obviously have serious track record when it comes to being in Jane Austen adaptations.
Yes.
And one last comment is that in this one, Charles Hayter was played by Timothy West, who was married to Prunella Scales, and they are the father of Samuel West, who in 1995 Persuasion will play Mr. Elliot.
I think he read most of the Audible books by Trollope that I've listened to.
But that's about all I can say about that one, because all I've been able to see is one still photo from it.
Yes.
So what I'm actually talking about today is the 1971 BBC adaptation. That was 5 episodes of about 45 minutes, later released on DVD in just 2 DVDs.
Yes.
I thought I owned it on DVD, but it turned out I don't. However, someone has put it all on YouTube, so I was able to watch it there.
Yes.
Anne Elliot is played by Anne Furbank. Captain Wentworth is played by Brian Marshall. I won't go through reading the whole cast list because they were almost entirely people I was not familiar with.
All right.
So this production, like the book, starts with the Baronetage and Sir Walter Elliot reading aloud from it. And
Yeah.
that is intercut with shots of the characters as he talks about them. No dialogue generally, but just little scenes of them. So you were given the name and then you saw the actor. which was a nice way of introducing people. Maybe not an exciting opening, but it helped give you a lot of context, which after all is what those opening chapters do.
Well, it really depends on how entertaining or attractive the pictures of the individual people are.
Yeah. Now, the scene where Mr. Shepherd is managing Sir Walter into letting out Kellynch Hall, we talked about how he's obviously brought Mrs. Clay along with him to help him manage Sir Walter. In this one, there was just one little shot that suggested Elizabeth is also working with him to manage Sir Walter. You just get them glancing at each other, which I thought was quite a nice touch.
Oh, really? Yes.
All of Anne's backstory comes out in a conversation with Lady Russell where we get most of the details.
Well, that's how you get told about it.
Yeah. When Anne is arriving at Uppercross, Mary sees her out through the window and then goes and lies down on the sofa.
Yes.
This is something we're going to see again in at least one other adaptation. The backstory about Dick Musgrove in this one comes from Mary, which I found a little bit odd, but I suppose Mary complaining and saying he's only ever been Dick Musgrove, if you're going to have it coming from one character, Mary is probably the right one. Because there are quite a lot of backstories you have to get into this that they have to creatively work around.
Yes.
Because this has quite a lot of time, it actually follows the events of the novel very closely. It has almost all of the events, even some that other adaptations leave out. With one exception, again, an exception that most other adaptations leave out too, but it's a bit disappointing. They don't have the scene of little Walter climbing on Anne's back and Captain Wentworth taking him off.
Oh, right.
Which is sad because it's a lovely scene.
Yes.
Although that's a Charles Hayter scene, and Charles Hayter often gets fairly short shrift in these adaptations.
Yes.
But in this one, they do have an earlier scene with him of him trying to talk to Henrietta about getting a curacy with Dr. Shirley while Louisa is looking out the window for Captain Wentworth, which again is a scene in the book you don't often see in adaptations. And I thought it did give a nice picture of what was happening in the Henrietta-Charles Hayter relationship.
Yes.
But that is the only scene we get of Charles Hayter before Winthrop. But it's actually, I think, a better character presenting scene and situation presenting scene than some of the other adaptations do.
Yes.
On the walk to Winthrop, we actually have Anne quoting poetry aloud, and Henrietta asks her to recite more, which again I think was them trying to get in some of that poetry and that sense of Anne reciting poetry without wanting to do any voiceover. Most of the Persuasion adaptations are notable for avoiding the use of voiceover and doing it all through acting. Which is possibly a moment where I should say the Anne actress in this really didn't do a lot for me. So this Anne seemed very placid. You didn't get a sense of much underneath emotion, though I suppose they were trying for that with the poetry. You didn't get any sense of her getting her bloom back by the time she's gone to Bath. She was very one note all the way through. Also, this is not the actress's fault, but to 21st century eyes, her hairstyle looked very 1970s all the way through. Not her fault, but there it is. Louisa, I found quite... The bits about her being jumped from the style seemed a bit unconvincing and irritating, and I was reminded of the word you used for Lady Bertram being infantilised, and I feel they have somewhat infantilised Louisa for some of these scenes to make it work, and it just didn't quite pan out for me. The shots of Lyme are actually rather bleak. It's the same in Bath. I think the film they're using, the colours are less saturated in the outdoor shots. So that's just the technology of the time, I think.
Yes.
Anne's thoughts about Benwick, that he's young, he will recover. She actually says those aloud to Louisa.
Yes.
I wrote down Captain Wentworth gives Mr. Elliot a dirty look. So,
oh, right.
And I've again written down for this section that Louisa is very irritating.
Yes.
So I said earlier that the different adaptations make different choices of the 3 sets of stairs there are on the Cobb. Well, this one chooses the set of stairs that I think is closest to the shoreline, and it's actually a double set of stairs. I'll put a picture up in the show notes.
Yes.
But it's basically like a triangle with stairs down each side and an inset bit in the body of the triangle with a little chair.
According to the picture, a little brick alcove with a seat within it.
Now, this is unlikely to be the set of stairs Jane Austen was envisaging. First of all, because I gather from something I've read online that possibly these ones weren't even built at the time Jane Austen was writing. There may have been stairs there, but I think these ones were rebuilt. But more importantly, she talks in the book about going to the new part of the Cobb. And if this is the closest to the shore, then it's definitely the old part of the Cobb.
Yes.
Also, compared to the other sets of stairs, they kind of don't feel quite right. So I'm guessing that either it was easier for the filming, for the set dressing, for the camera positions, that sort of thing, or they couldn't get permission to use the other ones. I'm thinking it was probably easier because they're also easier steps to manipulate. When Anne arrives at Bath, I wrote here in the Bath scenes, Sir Walter is good because he's not over-the-top comedy. Yes. He's not an over-the-top comic monster. So I found him quite good in just his profound indifference towards Anne.
Yes.
In the scene where Sir Walter is going on about who is Mrs. Smith,
yes,
Anne doesn't answer back to Sir Walter, and there's no voiceover, so you don't get that bit about Anne thinking to herself that her friend isn't the only widow between 30 and 40 in Bath.
Yes.
But there is a shot of Mrs. Clay looking uncomfortable when Sir Walter is going on about Mrs. Smith. So that was nice.
Yes.
The last thing is that we do see Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay running away together. We see him helping her up into a carriage, and then Sir Walter and Elizabeth receive a letter. And there's a little conversation of Sir Walter and Elizabeth talking about how they have to retain their dignity and not show how they feel about the betrayal by Mrs. Clay, which actually made me feel a bit sympathetic towards them. I thought it was quite a nice moment to show that, yes, they're horrible, but they can also be vulnerable.
Yes, yes.
It finishes with a conversation between Anne and Captain Wentworth. And he does talk about not having written to her when he was made captain. And the final line, he says, "I shall have to put up with being far happier than I deserve." Which, of course, is not dialogue in the book, but is a line from the book. And then it ends on them kissing each other. I was disappointed by Anne because she was so one note. And so I didn't engage with her that much. But I thought it was quite a faithful adaptation. It didn't have the bigger budgets of later adaptations. None of the actors was enormously charismatic, male or female. It was okay.
Yes.
Having watched it, I'm not sure I'm ever going to feel the desire to go back and rewatch it, but it was okay. So next time, I'm going to be talking about the 1972 production on Spanish television, which starred Maite Blasco and Juan Diego. And I have never seen this adaptation before. Until a few weeks ago, I didn't even know it existed, but it is entirely available on YouTube. And I've started it to be sure, and it does have English subtitles. So I will be watching it before the next episode.
Right.
You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be looking at chapters 4 to 6 of Persuasion.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on our website, readingjaneausten.com. We're also on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and Instagram at reading_Jane_Austen.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.